chapter 11, and it's verse 11 through to 18. Remember, the Lord Jesus had just come, what's called his triumphal procession. He's come, he's walked all the way from Jericho, which is about 15 miles, and an ascent as high as the ascent of Mount Snowdon, from sea level to the top of Mount Snowdon. And then he comes into Jerusalem on a donkey, on a donkey's colt, and the people are cheering and shouting as he comes in. And it says in verse 11, Jesus entered Jerusalem and came into the temple, and after looking around at everything, he left for Bethany with the 12, since it was already very late. So that was a full day, that was an exhausting day for all the disciples and the Lord Jesus. On the next day, when they had left Bethany, he became hungry. And seeing at a distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see if perhaps he would find anything on it. And when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples were listening. Then they come to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were buying and selling in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves. And he would not permit anyone to carry merchandise through the temple. And he began to teach and to say to them, Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations'? But you have made it a robber's den." The chief priests and the scribes heard this and began seeking how to destroy him, for they were afraid, for the whole crowd was astonished at his teaching. So just note here that the Lord Jesus, he comes into Jerusalem and he looks around. And then immediately the next morning, he is walking and he is hungry, and he looks and he sees a fig tree. And the fig tree speaks of Israel. And Jesus comes and he sees the fig tree in leaf, just like he had looked around Jerusalem the day before. And he comes to it, and he finds that it has no fruit on it. And he's hungry. Of course he's hungry. He's had an exhausting day the day before, and he's hungry. And he says, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And he does this, and then he goes into Jerusalem. And he goes back into the temple where he'd been the day before, having a look around. And he comes in, and he sees, and he began to drive out those who were buying and selling in the temple, and overturn the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves. And he wouldn't permit them to carry merchandise through the temple. And he began saying to them, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations. But you money changers, you priests and scribes, have made it a den of robbers." This is the most indignant we see the Lord Jesus. He has just almost symbolically come to this tree, and he said, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." He has come and he's seen it. The day before, he had looked around Jerusalem and he had looked around the temple, and now he comes in and he does exactly the same thing. He does exactly the same thing with the money changers and the people carrying merchandise throughout the temple. "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations'? But you have made it a den of robbers." You're stealing money from people. And what an indictment upon those Levites and those chief priests and those scribes, that Jesus would say, "You have turned this into a money-making business." But it should be a house of prayer for all nations. And I think that there's two meanings for that. One, it should be a house where prayers are lifted to the Lord for all the nations. And he was speaking to the Jewish nation there, you should be praying for all the nations, but it's also for all the nations. It's a house of prayer for all the nations to come to and pray. And he was saying that then there to them, it was a damning indictment really on how they had conducted themselves. But how much more should we be cognizant of how the Lord Jesus was when he came into this temple? And there is another temple, which is the called out ones, the church of the Lord Jesus. That is his temple. And those who have authority need to remember that God has said, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations. And we need to do everything we can to be those who won't make it into a den of robbers, where people steal money for themselves. These are sobering words for us.